Hello, my name is Christian Hollis, and my chosen topic for my presentation is the overarching impact of the Opium Wars on China. So, here's what I'll be discussing today. First, I'll review what opium is and what China's experience was with opium prior to the Opium Wars, and then I'll briefly touch on the wars themselves. And finally, I'll discuss the direct and indirect impact of what led to the Opium Wars, and finally, the ultimate or overarching impact on China. So opium has been around for a very long time, as early as 3400 BC, when it was originally being cultivated in lower Mesopotamia. Opium, derived from the poppy plant, is under the umbrella term of narcotic, which involves both opium based and opium derived drugs such as heroin and morphine. It was used medicinally and recreationally in ancient civilizations such as ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, and ultimately became Europe's primary pharmaceutical trading commodity during the 1600s. And it goes without saying that opium, being the highly addictive substance that it is, has played a role in many conflicts over the years and has contributed to many of mid modern China's struggles, which we will discuss now. So it's important to make a distinction of China's experience with opium, first, prior to Britain's involvement, and second, and almost most notably, the experience after Britain became integrally involved. Previously, China used opium recreationally and socially. There was not any notable or documented occurrence of addiction. What's important to point out is opium. This opium was locally grown in China, whereas the opium source that the British had was from India, and India's poppy plant was much more potent than what China was accustomed to, and thus led to many to seek out the substance out of intrigue rather than social ritual. So, why did Britain become so deeply involved with trade in China in the first place? Well, this is because China had things that Britain wanted. They had tea, which, is pretty British, and tea allowed an opportunity for people to showcase their fine china and fine cutlery ware that they also imported from China. So, it was a kind of a status thing. Second is silk. Silk represented wealth and status. So importing things from China was mainly a British social status thing. And it's very important to note that for Britain, opium was a means of currency in acquiring goods from China as literally an alternative to silver. And this is because Britain was kind of running dry on money after, uh, colonialism in America and just getting India under control. So it was kind of rough for them. And I mean, in general, using opium as a currency for tea, silk, and other goods, while beneficial to Britain, it had a destabilizing impact on China, impacting China's financial stability, their trade, and very significantly, the people. And it's important to note that China was dealing with a narcotic addiction to some extent prior to British involvement, but we won't get into that. So enter the Opium Wars between Britain and China. China placed restrictions on opium trade, and Britain contested these restrictions where they could, and they tried to work around it, and this eventually led to the Opium Wars. Now, I won't get too into what happened during the wars. What's important to know is that they led to China having to accept trade policies that they didn't want to, and ultimately led to the westernization of Asia as a whole. Right. So finally, I want to just talk about the impact of the opium quote unquote myth. What I mean is that the concept of the imagery of an opium addict was at the time, and still is in many regards, warped and utilized by Chinese imperial reformers. This image basically was the opposite of collectivist ideals, that being a degenerative, slow, useless, non contributing person. And while maybe not necessarily being that extreme, in general, the concept of an opium addict was painted in such a way that it represented the West, or what they could have, or what they had done, to China. It is kind of similar to what occurred in Germany after World War One, where their national identity and pride was hurt enough to warrant redemption, or in Imperial China's case, prevention of Western influence from spreading any further. In essence, because of the Opium Wars and the damage they caused, China hated anything that did not reflect their ideals because they perceived it as a threat. This narrative directly impacted Chinese adoption of communism, as the imperialists correlated that to returning to Chinese core values and ideals, that of the collective. And so, in conclusion, Britain's economic ventures in China in the late 1800s ultimately had a global effect, as China's resulting conversion to communism for social redemption led to a directional impact on the country. So here are the sources. I'll link them in the description. Here's also a few extra sources if you're like extra curious. Thank you for listening, and good night or goodbye.